The call came in at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning, the kind of crisp autumn day when fog still clung to the manicured lawns of Riverside Heights, where only the wealthiest could afford to breathe. Detective Sarah Brennan arrived at the Hargrove estate within 20 minutes. Her partner, Detective James Chen, already standing at the ornate iron gates, speaking with uniformed officers who looked uncomfortable in the shadow of such opulence. The mansion rose before them like a monument to excess, all stone and glass and perfectly trimmed hedges that probably cost more to maintain than most people's mortgages. Theodore Hargrove was dead. That much was certain. What wasn't certain was why Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach as she walked through the marble foyer, past oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors and crystal chandeliers that caught the morning light like frozen tears. The family physician, Dr. Raymond Walsh, met them in the study where the body lay slumped in a leather chair that probably cost more than Sarah's car. He was 76 years old, the doctor explained, his voice steady and professional, and he had a history of heart problems. Natural causes, most likely. Nothing suspicious, just the inevitable end of a long, successful life. But Sarah had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and something about the scene felt wrong. It wasn't the body itself, positioned too perfectly, almost staged. It wasn't the untouched glass of brandy on the side table, or the book left open at a page that suggested he'd been reading moments before death claimed him. It was the family. 3 adult children stood in the adjacent sitting room, their grief performative and hollow, like actors who'd rehearsed their lines but forgotten to feel the words. Victoria Hargrove Sterling, the eldest at 42, stood by the window with her arms crossed, her designer suit immaculate, her face a mask of controlled composure that never quite reached her eyes. Marcus Hargrove, 38, paced near the fireplace, his jaw clenched, checking his phone every few seconds as though death was merely an inconvenient interruption to his schedule. And Cassandra Hargrove, the youngest at 34, sat on the edge of a velvet sofa, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief. Her performance more convincing than her siblings, but still somehow lacking authentic sorrow. James began interviewing the family while Sarah examined the study more carefully. Everything was pristine, untouched, as though Theodore had simply decided to die in the most convenient manner possible. The desk was organized, papers neatly stacked, a fountain pen aligned perfectly parallel to the edge. Too perfect. Sarah opened drawers carefully, finding exactly what one would expect in a wealthy man's study. Expensive stationery, business documents, a humidor of Cuban cigars. Nothing unusual. Nothing except the persistent feeling that she was missing something crucial. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Delgado, who mentioned Edwin. She was a small woman in her 50s, hands trembling as she answered Sarah's questions, and when asked about the household staff, she paused, glanced toward the family in the other room, and lowered her voice. Edwin Moss, she said, the butler. He'd been with the family for 32 years, longer than anyone. He knew everything about the Hargroves, every secret, every routine. But he died 3 weeks ago, sudden and unexpected, and the family had seemed relieved rather than grieved by his passing. Mrs. Delgado's eyes held something Sarah recognized immediately. Fear mixed with knowledge, the look of someone who knew more than they dared say. Sarah found James outside, comparing notes with uniformed officers who were preparing to release the scene. She pulled him aside, away from listening ears, and told him about Edwin. James frowned, that particular expression he got when a case started to develop complications. They needed to find out more about this Butler, he agreed. Something felt off about the entire situation. The family was too composed, too prepared, as though they'd been expecting this death rather than mourning it. The break came 2 days later, when Sarah received a call from Marcus Chen, no relation to her partner, who managed the storage facility on the edge of town. A unit rented under Edwin Moss's name had gone unpaid after his death, and in accordance with their policy, they'd opened it to catalog contents before auction. What they found inside wasn't furniture or family heirlooms. It was boxes. Dozens of boxes filled with notebooks, journals, documents, and photographs spanning 3 decades. Marcus Chen, uncomfortable and uncertain, had started reading one of the journals and immediately realized he needed to call the police. Sarah and James arrived within the hour. The storage unit was small, maybe 10 by 10, but it felt cavernous as Sarah stepped inside and saw the sheer volume of documentation Edwin had accumulated. The journals were organized chronologically, each one labeled with dates in precise handwriting. Sarah pulled the most recent volume, dated just weeks before Edwin's death, and began reading. The first entry made her blood run cold. "They think I don't know," Edwin had written. "They think I'm just the help, invisible and ignorant, a fixture like the furniture. But I know everything. I've always known. And now that Dr. Walsh has given me 6 months, perhaps less, I've decided it's time the world knows too." The Hargrove fortune wasn't built on innovation or hard work. It was built on murder. And I helped them do it. James looked over her shoulder, his face pale. Sarah continued reading, her hands shaking slightly as Edwin's meticulous documentation unfolded before her. He'd started working for the Hargrove family in 1991, hired by Theodore when the business was struggling, when competitors threatened to crush the fledgling Hargrove Industries. Theodore had been desperate, according to Edwin's account, willing to do anything to save his company and provide for his young family. That desperation led to a conversation late one night, after too much whiskey, when Theodore confessed his darkest thoughts. He wished his main competitor, Richard Sutton, would simply disappear, just vanish. Then the contracts would come to Hargrove Industries instead. Edwin had been a different man back then, the journal revealed. Younger, harder, with a past he'd been running from, military service that had taught him skills most men never learned, and he'd seen an opportunity, not just employment, but security, a place to belong, so he'd made Theodore an offer. If someone took care of the Richard Sutton problem, would Theodore be grateful enough to ensure lifelong employment and generous compensation? Theodore, drunk and desperate, had agreed, probably thinking it was just whiskey talk, hypothetical fantasy. Richard Sutton died 3 weeks later in what appeared to be a random mugging gone wrong. Killed in an alley downtown, his wallet taken, no witnesses. The police investigated, found nothing, and eventually the case went cold. Hargrove Industries secured the contracts that had been going to Sutton's company. Theodore's fortune began to grow, and Edwin became not just the butler, but the family's darkest secret and most valuable asset. Sarah had to stop reading, her stomach churning. James was going through other journals, his face growing darker with each page. This wasn't just one murder, it was dozens. Edwin had documented everything with the precision of an accountant recording transactions. 1993, a journalist investigating Hargrove Industries' environmental violations died in a suspicious car accident. 1996, a whistleblower employee who threatened to expose financial fraud disappeared, his body never found. 1999, a rival CEO who refused to sell her company died of apparent food poisoning at a restaurant where Edwin had, according to his notes, bribed a server to add something special to her meal. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Every time someone threatened the Hargrove empire, they died. Every time someone stood in Theodore's way, they were removed. And Edwin orchestrated it all, sometimes killing himself, sometimes arranging accidents, sometimes hiring others to do the work while he maintained perfect deniability. He'd been paid well, he noted. Bonuses that came in cash, a cottage on the estate property, complete financial security. But more than that, he'd been made to feel essential, valued, part of the family in a way that transcended mere employment. But the journals revealed something even more disturbing as they progressed into the 2000s. The children had been brought into the conspiracy. Victoria first, when she was 25, and working her way up in the family business. Edwin described a conversation in his journal where Theodore had explained to his daughter that sometimes business required difficult decisions, that their competitors weren't always willing to play fair, and that the family had resources others didn't. Victoria, according to Edwin's observations, had barely blinked. She'd ask practical questions about exposure and risk, about ensuring nothing could be traced back to them. She'd embraced the family's dark legacy without hesitation, seeing it as a competitive advantage rather than moral catastrophe. Marcus had been next, at 28, after a deal went bad, and he'd come to his father furious and desperate. Edwin recorded the late-night meeting in Theodore's study. How Marcus had raged about a businessman named Foster, who'd cheated him, stolen clients, spread rumors that damaged Marcus's reputation. Theodore had looked at Edwin, and Edwin had nodded. Foster died 2 weeks later in what appeared to be a home invasion. Marcus never asked questions, but from that point forward, he understood the power at his disposal. Cassandra, the youngest, had been different. Edwin's entries about her were tinged with something almost like sympathy. She'd found out by accident, apparently, walking in on a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. She'd been horrified, according to Edwin, had screamed and cried and threatened to go to the police. But Victoria and Marcus had handled her, not with threats, but with logic. They'd explained that exposing the family would destroy everything, including Cassandra herself. They'd reminded her of the lifestyle she enjoyed, the opportunities she'd been given, the future that awaited her. And slowly, gradually, they'd worn down her resistance until acceptance replaced horror. She'd never participated directly, Edwin noted, but she'd learned to look the other way, to enjoy the benefits while maintaining plausible deniability about the cost. Sarah felt sick as she read through years of carefully documented crimes. Edwin had recorded names, dates, methods, outcomes. He'd kept newspaper clippings about the deaths, police reports he'd somehow obtained, even photographs in some cases. It was the most comprehensive confession she'd ever seen, and it implicated not just Theodore, but his entire family in a murder conspiracy that spanned 3 decades and claimed at least 23 lives. But why had Edwin documented everything? That question was answered in entries from earlier this year, after his cancer diagnosis. Edwin had realized that his loyalty had been misplaced. He'd given the Hargroves everything, had become a monster for them, had sacrificed any hope of a normal life or real relationships. And in return, they'd treated him with casual indifference. He was still just the help to them, still invisible despite knowing all their secrets. When he'd told Theodore about his diagnosis, seeking perhaps some acknowledgement of their decades together, Theodore had merely nodded and asked if Edwin had trained someone to replace him. No sympathy, no gratitude, just concern about staffing logistics. That's when Edwin had decided to destroy them, not quickly or overtly, but methodically, the same way he'd helped them build their empire. He'd begun writing everything down, organizing evidence, preparing a package that would ensure the Hargrove legacy would be one of infamy rather than success. And he'd made arrangements for this evidence to be discovered after both his death and Theodore's, timing it perfectly so the family couldn't destroy it before the truth emerged. The final entries revealed Edwin's last act. He'd poisoned Theodore himself, using a slow-acting compound in the old man's daily medication that would mimic a heart attack, ensuring Theodore's death looked natural while Edwin was already dead and beyond suspicion. It was elaborate, cold, and perfectly executed. Edwin had died of his cancer 3 weeks ago, at peace with his decision. Theodore had died as planned, never knowing his faithful butler had betrayed him from beyond the grave. Sarah closed the journal, her mind reeling. James was on the phone with the district attorney, explaining what they'd found, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. This was going to be the biggest case of their careers, possibly the biggest in the city's history. A wealthy, respected family exposed as serial killers, their fortune literally built on corpses. The media would explode. The legal proceedings would take years. Lives would be destroyed. They drove back to the Hargrove estate, this time with warrants and backup. The family was gathered for dinner when they arrived, seated around an enormous dining table set with fine china and crystal, discussing funeral arrangements and estate matters with the casual entitlement of people who'd never faced real consequences. Victoria looked up as Sarah and James entered with uniformed officers, her expression shifting from annoyance to something resembling fear as she saw their faces. Sarah placed Edwin's journals on the table, watching as recognition and horror spread across 3 faces. Marcus stood up so quickly his chair fell backward, his composure shattering. Cassandra went pale, her hands gripping the table's edge. Victoria remained seated, but her eyes locked on the journals with the intensity of someone watching their world collapse. Edwin Moss kept detailed records, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. 32 years of records. Every crime, every murder, every death your family ordered or committed. He documented everything and he made sure we found it. Victoria's laugh was bitter and sharp. Edwin's dead. You have nothing but the ravings of a dying man, probably delusional from medication. Those journals would never hold up in court. But James shook his head. He didn't just write about the crimes. He kept evidence, physical evidence. We have photographs, documents, financial records that corroborate every entry. We have proof of payments, emails, even recorded conversations in some cases. He was meticulous. He knew exactly what we'd need to build a case. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. He was loyal for decades. Why would he do this? We took care of him. We gave him everything. Sarah met his eyes, seeing the genuine confusion there, the inability to understand that Edwin's loyalty had been bought, not earned, and that even bought loyalty has its limits. He was dying, and he realized that despite giving you everything, despite becoming a murderer for your family, you never saw him as anything more than an employee. When he told your father about his cancer, your father's only concern was finding a replacement. Cassandra started crying, real tears this time, not the performance from days ago. I didn't want this. I never wanted any of this. They made me keep quiet. They said we'd all go to prison if I talked. You'll all go to prison anyway, James said, not unkindly. But cooperation might make a difference in sentencing. The arrests were almost anticlimactic after the emotional intensity of the confrontation. Victoria remained silent and composed, already calculating legal strategies. Marcus raged and threatened, calling lawyers and making predictions about who they knew, what strings they could pull, as though money and influence could erase documented evidence of 23 murders. Cassandra collapsed into quiet devastation, the weight of years of complicity finally breaking through her practiced denial. In the days that followed, as forensic accountants dug through Hargrove Industries' finances, and investigators tracked down evidence Edwin had referenced in his journals, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The family had eliminated competitors, silenced whistleblowers, murdered anyone who threatened their empire's growth. They'd become so accustomed to using death as a business tool that it had become routine, just another strategy in the boardroom arsenal. Sarah spent weeks reading through Edwin's journals, trying to understand the man who'd been both victim and villain, both enabler and executioner. His final entry, written days before his death, stayed with her. I became what they needed me to be, he'd written, and in doing so I lost what I could have been. But I'm taking them with me into darkness. It's not redemption. Redemption isn't possible for what I've done. But it's justice, of a sort. The Hargrove fortune will be remembered as blood money, and my name will be remembered as the man who exposed them. It's not much of a legacy, but it's more honest than anything the Hargroves ever built. The trials would take years. The legal battles over the estate would be endless. But Sarah found some satisfaction in knowing that Edwin's final act had succeeded. The Hargrove name would forever be associated with murder, not success. Their empire was collapsing as partners fled and contracts were canceled. Justice, delayed by decades and delivered by an unlikely hand, had finally arrived. Standing in the empty storage unit after the last boxes had been cataloged and removed, Sarah thought about all the victims Edwin had documented. The lives cut short to fuel one family's ambition. She thought about Edwin himself, trapped by choices made decades ago, spending his final months ensuring he didn't die with those secrets. And she thought about the Hargrove children, raised in luxury built on corpses, taught that money and power placed them beyond consequences until a dying Butler proved otherwise. The journal had been Edwin's confession, his revenge, and ultimately his attempt at making one thing right in a life filled with wrong choices. It wasn't enough to balance the scales, but it was something. And sometimes, Sarah reflected as she locked the storage unit for the final time, something was all you got. What secrets do you think wealthy families really keep behind closed doors? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories of dark family legacies and long-delayed justice intrigue you, subscribe to our channel and hit that like button for more investigations into the crimes hidden behind power and privilege. Until the next case.